I was always taught that anything too strong, too intense, too beautiful was likely a trap. My father said a godly woman's soul should be as calm as the sea on a quiet day. But what if the sea inside me was never tame? What if every prayer ended with a plea I never dared confess aloud? I grew up surrounded by sacred words, controlled smiles, and suffocating expectations. My name, Elsa, was spoken with pride at church gatherings as if it were a trophy of purity. The pastor's daughter, the girl who doesn't question, the one who knows her place. But inside I was a dam about to burst. I felt more. I always had. And that's why, when I saw that body sprawled on the sand, pale skin, cracked lips, chest rising faintly as if fighting death, something in me trembled, not from fear, from recognition, as if that strange, wounded figure had come from far away just to remind me I was still alive. I knelt beside him, heart racing, a silent scream echoing in the depths of my soul. I should have run, shouted, called my father. But I did none of that. I just touched his cold hand with mine, and in that moment something shifted. An entire world hidden inside me began to stir. And I knew, without knowing how, that nothing from that point on would ever be the same. That morning the world felt different. The storm from the night before had left a dense silence, as if even God had held his breath. I'd gone out early to walk, trying to shake the restlessness that had gripped me since my last argument with my father. Another lecture about obedience, about how a Christian woman should behave, about the narrow, straight paths meant to lead me to salvation. But that day, I didn't want to be saved. I just wanted to breathe without asking permission. I walked along the beach, searching for air within my own skin, and then I saw him. At first I thought it was an illusion, but as I drew closer, I realized it was a man, alone, collapsed, surrendered. There was something both poetic and brutal in it, a body abandoned by the sea, offered to the land like a secret. He was alive, though barely breathing. And though I didn't know who he was, where he came from, or what he represented, I knelt and touched his hand. In that almost accidental touch, something ignited inside me with a force no pulpit word had ever stirred. I called to him, but he didn't respond. His eyes were closed, his face battered, his chest heaving with effort, and I, with trembling hands, felt a courage I didn't recognize in myself. It was in that moment of madness or revelation that it all began. Carrying him to town was an act I didn't think through. I just did. My arms, my entire body, moved as if they knew what to do. It was as if something greater than me was guiding me. When I finally reached the house of the old woman who cared for the town sick, my clothes were soaked, my legs ached, but my heart pounded with a fury I'd never felt before. He was laid on a simple bed, tended with herbs and prayers, while I watched from a distance, fingers clasped, soul suspended. They asked where he came from. I said I didn't know. They asked if he was known. I shook my head. But inside me, there was a nameless certainty. This man had entered my world for a reason. As the days passed and he fought to wake, I visited him in secret. I didn't touch him, didn't speak, just sat there, watching his slow breathing, the traces of salt on his skin, the gentle movement of his fingers. Sometimes I imagined he'd open his eyes and say my name. Other times, I just wanted him to breathe once more. And in that shared silence, I began to discover a part of myself I'd never known. The part that dreams awake, that desires, that rages at everything it was denied. My father, of course, grew suspicious. He always sensed when something in me strayed from the line. The veiled questions began. Why was I so absent? Why did my gaze seem distant? Why did I return with sandy feet even after cleaning the church? I answered with half words, as I always had, but inside, Something was already screaming. For the first time, I didn't want to obey. I wanted to understand the fire that was starting to consume my nights, my thoughts, my dreams, and all this for a man who didn't even have a name. Or maybe he did, but he didn't know it himself. When he finally woke, dark, intense, confused eyes, and asked in a hoarse voice where he was, my heart raced. He seemed lost, as if reborn, cast by the sea toward me. And I, with my voice caught in my throat, could only say, "You're safe now." But the truth was, I was the one at risk, because from that moment loving stopped being a possibility and became a sentence. His name was Jonah, or at least that's what we called him when we realized he couldn't remember his own. It was the old woman tending his wounds who named him, saying every man rescued from the sea deserved a name with a story. There was something in how he reacted to hearing Jonah for the first time. A slight furrow of his brow, as if it both belonged to him and didn't, but the name didn't matter. It was the look. When he opened his eyes a second time and saw me sitting by his bed, a near serene expression crossed his battered face. He didn't say anything. He just looked for long seconds, and in that silence, something was established between us, something that needed no explanation. And I, raised to never linger on a man's gaze, to never give an opening to sin, didn't look away. I met his eyes as if he were the first man I'd truly seen, because he was. Not for his appearance, nor for desire, but because he saw me too. He saw me as a woman, not as the pastor's daughter, nor the church girl, but as someone whole, made of desires, doubts, and a thirst for life. And in that look, I began to betray everything I'd been taught to be. The days that followed were like living a secret in broad daylight. Jonah was recovering quickly, but he still didn't remember who he was or how he ended up there. Stories were invented, of course. They said he must be a fugitive, a foreigner shipwrecked while escaping something, or perhaps a smuggler. The town's sharp tongues needed no facts to spin tales. I listened to it all with my heart in my fists, protecting inside me the image I built of him each day. He was kind, soft-spoken, and asked me questions as if every answer I gave helped him piece together a larger puzzle. He asked about the town, about me, about the things I liked. I found myself smiling with him as I hadn't since I was a girl, as if my face were rediscovering the muscles of joy. I started bringing him books, fruit, small pieces of the outside world, and he in return gave me time, listening, presence. With him, I could be just Elsa, and that was new, liberating, terrifying. It didn't take long for my father to sense something was wrong. He always had an almost divine instinct for detecting sin, or any sign of deviation that threatened. The altar of reputation he'd built over decades. He started following me with his eyes everywhere. His prayers before meals took on a sharper tone. He spoke of purity more often, eyed my dresses as if expecting them to one day appear shorter, bolder, and I was beginning to feel like someone, walking between two worlds, one of obedience and one of discovery. I wanted to pull back, to tell myself this was just gratitude, empathy, Christian compassion. But it wasn't. It was desire. It was hunger. It was something growing inside me with roots so deep that even faith couldn't choke it out. The night I dreamed of him for the first time, I woke sweating, heart racing, lips parted as if my entire body had lived what my mind still wouldn't allow. I sat up in bed and cried silently. Not from guilt, but from relief. Because for the first time, I didn't feel dead inside. Life was returning, even if it came by the most dangerous path, even if it set me against everything I'd been taught to protect. Jonah was the beginning of the end of the Elsa the world knew. And somehow, that was the truest thing I'd ever felt. The next morning, my father called me to talk. His voice was firm, his face stern, and an open Bible lay on the table, as if the presence of Scripture made the coming sermon inevitable. He began slowly, speaking of responsibilities, of the vigilance we must keep over our own hearts, of how bad company corrupts good character. Words I knew by heart, like a second skin. But that morning, they pierced me differently. For the first time, they sounded hollow. Not because he lied, but because that truth was no longer mine. When he mentioned Jonah without even saying his name, calling him the lost man the sea spat at our door, a knot formed in my throat. He asked coldly if I was getting involved, and I, staring into his eyes, said no. I lied, out of fear, out of instinct, out of knowing that if I confirmed it, he'd try to tear me from the only thing that made sense in that moment. I left that room with my stomach churning and my chest ablaze, as if I'd betrayed two people at once, my father and myself. That same day, I went to where Jonah was staying. He was outside, gazing at the sea with narrowed eyes, as if expecting a memory to rise from the waves. When he saw me, he smiled that discreet, steady smile of his, as if he knew I'd return, as if he never doubted me. I stayed silent for a while, just watching his broad shoulders, the marks of sun and salt on his skin, the way his fingers idly toyed with a seashell. And then, without thinking, I asked, "What if you remember who you are and don't like what? You find?" He looked at me as if he'd asked himself that question 1,000 times, and he answered with the calm that always disarmed me. "Then I choose to remember from here." That undid me, because that was what I feared most. That the past would come and take everything back, including what we were building. But he didn't seem worried. He was there, whole, in the present. And that made me want to stay more, to be more, to live more, even if everything was about to collapse. That night during the service, my father preached about temptation. He spoke of Samson, of Delilah, of the deceit of human emotions. He said, "The devil doesn't come with horns but with smiles." And I knew, with every word hurled through the microphone, that he was speaking of me and of Jonah. The congregation nodded, murmured, "Amen," cast sharp glances, and I, sitting in the front row, felt like I was in an invisible trial. But for the first time, I didn't bow inside. Something in me was too awake to go back to sleep. Something no alto-spoken word could extinguish anymore. And when I got home, before bed, I opened my Bible for the first time, not seeking answers, but to let the questions echo in peace. And there, among yellowed pages and promises of salvation, I understood. God was still speaking to me, but now he was using the voice of the sea. In the days that followed, everything seemed to move in silence, as if the world were just waiting for a decision to be made. Jonah was starting to blend into the town's routine, though his face still drew curious looks and hushed whispers around corners. He spoke little, but his presence was like the tide, calm, constant, impossible to contain. And I, who'd always walked on eggshells, careful not to displease, began to experiment with a new way of existing. With him, I didn't need to explain myself. I could just be present, and for someone like me, that was a revolution. Our conversations grew deeper. We talked about faith, about doubt, about things I'd never dared question aloud. And when he listened, he didn't correct me. He just listened with that attentive gaze that made me feel important. For the first time, someone saw me not as a reflection of the rules surrounding me, but as a woman who thinks, feels, and desires. I began to realize how small the world that shaped me was. The church, the parsonage hallways, the ladies' meetings that spent more time judging than loving. It all felt narrow now. Not because I'd stopped believing in God, but because I was discovering He existed far beyond the limits I'd been taught. There was something divine in the way Jonah looked at the sea, something sacred in the silence between us. And maybe that's why the guilt, which once crushed me for any thought outside the norm, now barely found space inside me. I was still, torn, yes, but not between good and evil as before. I was torn between two versions of myself, the one I'd been molded to be and the one I was discovering on my own. And it was in this state of internal discord that one afternoon, Jonah asked me to walk to a more isolated part of the coast. He said something was stirring in him, something from within, as if his memories were surfacing slowly without permission. We went in silence, and I felt a heavy heart, as if sensing we were nearing something that would change everything. We sat side by side, and for the first time, he spoke of fear. Fear of remembering who he'd been. Fear of not liking the truth. He said he sometimes dreamed of screams, of water flooding his mouth, of hands trying to hold him. He had flashes of a name, a boat, a face. But it all faded before making sense. And then he turned to me with quiet resolve in his eyes and said, "If I remember and it's not good, will you still stay?" I didn't answer. I just reached out and laced my fingers with his. Because in that moment I knew what we felt didn't depend on who we'd been. It depended only on who we were being, for each other now. But the peace didn't last. My father found out. I don't know how or by whom, but somehow he knew the depth of our connection. And the explosion came like thunder. He shouted, called me foolish, ungrateful, a fallen woman. He said I shamed his name, the church, the God we served. His words, sharp as a blade, echoed inside me for hours. But what hurt most wasn't the judgment. It was realizing that to him, my worth existed only as long as I obeyed. That my heart was the property of doctrine, not a pulsing organ capable of loving on its own. And there, standing before him, eyes burning and hands trembling, I knew the choice I most feared was approaching, and once made, there'd be no going back. That night I couldn't sleep. The room felt smaller, the walls tighter, as if every verse framed on them watched me with condemning eyes. I tried to pray. I closed my eyes and repeated the words I'd been taught since childhood, but they sounded empty, mechanical, as if they were no longer mine. I realized that perhaps they never had been. The faith I carried was inherited, not chosen. And now, facing the storm inside me, I wanted more than the repetition of memorized prayers. I wanted truth. And my truth was this feeling that grew with every look, every word, every silence shared with Jonah. This love that didn't ask permission, that didn't fit the mold, but let me breathe for the first time without fear of being who I was. In the days that followed, my father tried to keep me under watch. He banned visits, reorganized my routine, filled my schedule with church tasks. It was his way of pulling me back in line, but it was too late. What once sufficed now suffocated me. I lived in a state of absence, doing what was expected of me, with my body present, but my soul elsewhere. Jonah noticed. He found me by chance, or perhaps guided by something greater, behind the general store, where I'd go to breathe alone for a few minutes. He didn't say anything. He just approached slowly and looked at me with that expression that always undid me. There was a shadow in his eyes, a new fear, as if he sensed I was pulling away. And in a way, I was. Not from him, but from the courage. From the strength that had brought me this far. I clung to him as if trying to hold a piece of my own soul. And there, against his chest, he told me something that haunted him. A memory had returned, clear, and it hurt. He remembered the name of a boat And an accident, a fire, screams, and a woman crying for him. He didn't know if she was a wife, a lover, a friend. But her look was one of despair. Jonah told me this with a trembling voice, eyes full of tears, as if confessing a betrayal he didn't know he'd committed. And I, though I wanted to comfort him, felt the weight of that revelation inside me. Because that woman, lost in his memories, was real, and I was the present. But what if she was the love of his life? What if, when he remembered everything, he left me? Fear washed over me like the sea slowly swallowing the sand. And for the first time since finding him, I wanted to run, not from Jonah, but from everything I couldn't control. On the way home, my father was waiting at the door, eyes hard, arms crossed like a verdict. He told me the community was talking, that my name was whispered with scandal in the hallways, that my presence at services caused discomfort. And then, with all the coldness possible, he gave me an ultimatum. Either I cut all ties with that man, or I'd cease to be a daughter under his roof. He said there was still time to clear my name, to save my future, to return to the path of salvation. And in that moment something inside me broke, because I realized that to him, my salvation depended on erasing everything that made me alive. He didn't want my peace. He wanted my submission. And that's when I knew. The moment had come. That night I sat on the edge of my bed for hours, no tears, no prayers, no escapes, just silence. A dense, honest silence that for the first time put me face to face with myself. I knew what I had to do, and knowing hurt more than any punishment, any expulsion. It was a grieving. For the perfect daughter, the girl molded by others' eyes, the Elsa who lived to please. The Elsa I knew would die in that choice, and in her place, someone I didn't yet fully understand would be born. But she would finally be mine. The next day, before the sun rose, I packed a small bag with some clothes, a book, my mother's Bible, the only memory tying me to family affection, and a note. I didn't apologize. I didn't beg for understanding. I wrote only what was necessary, that I was going to live what I felt, not what was expected of me, that it wasn't an act of rebellion, but of courage, and that if they ever wanted to truly know me, they'd find me whole, not half. I left the note folded on the kitchen table and closed the door behind me with steady hands and a heart ablaze. Each step on the pavement felt like a farewell to the house, the town, the old version of me. But with every meter, I also felt the arrival of something new, and that's how it hurt and healed at once. I found Jonah by the sea, as if he already knew I'd come. He was sitting on a rock, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if searching for an answer that hadn't yet come. When he saw me, he didn't smile. He just stood slowly, as if respecting the gravity of the moment. I approached without words, bag in hand, and simply said, "I'm here." And in that instant his eyes filled with tears, but not from sadness. It was as if he, too, had been waiting for this his whole life. He pulled me close, wrapped me in his arms, and for the first time, I felt I didn't need to hide any part of myself. We were there, two loose fragments of the world, ready to build something new with what remained of our scars. In the days that followed, we left the town, with help from a childhood friend who offered shelter and silence. There, amid winds and lingering afternoons, Jonah began to remember more. His full name, the accident, the life he'd had before me. He told me everything, with pauses, with pain, but with truth. The woman from his dreams had been his wife. She died in that fire. He survived, but was left adrift, in body, mind, and soul. And it was the sea, in the end, that returned him to the world and gave me the chance to find him. I cried for her. I cried for him. I cried for us. And there, amid the wreckage of pain, something even stronger was born. The certainty that even with scarred pasts, we were still worthy of a living present. And that's how I understood that true love doesn't demand we deny who we were, but that we have the courage to be who we are now. Jonah wasn't my beginning, nor I his. But in that improbable meeting of faith and salt, obedience and desire, land and sea, life finally began. Time moved differently after that, as if the days were no longer in a hurry, as if every minute lived with Jonah taught me that life, when lived with truth, doesn't demand rushing, only presence. We lived in a simple house, lent by someone who understood, without judgment, that sometimes a fresh start needs only a safe corner and enough silence for the heart to breathe. I'd wake to him making coffee and spend much of the mornings watching. His small gestures, sweeping the porch, watering plants, writing fragments of his past life in old notebooks. He was a man who still carried pain, yes, but now he also carried purpose. And I, who once lived to meet expectations, learned to exist to feel. Every now and then, the past knocked. A letter from my father arrived weeks later. It was short, harsh. It said I was free to make my choices, but that came with the weight of being outside the family's and congregation's blessing. No word of longing, no attempt at closeness. That hurt more than I was prepared to admit, but it also gave me peace, because reading it, I understood my worth was never in the words he spoke about me to others, but in the woman I was learning to be, far from his shadow. Jonah held me when I finished reading. He didn't say anything. He just hugged me with a firmness that said, "You're not alone." And I wasn't. I never would be again. In time, we started working with the region's fishermen. Jonah was skilled with nets, and I learned to clean fish and manage accounts. It was simple, tiring work, but it smelled of freedom. Sometimes we'd sit at the end of the day by the dock, watching the sun sink slowly, as if even it respected the new rhythm of our existence. In those moments, he'd tell me he still didn't know everything about who he'd been, but he now knew who he wanted to be, the man who loved me calmly, truthfully, with open hands. And I'd smile, because what we had wasn't a fairy tale. It was a quiet miracle, an improbable meeting of two shattered souls who chose to rebuild without haste, without pressure, without fear. One day, months later, I had an unexpected visitor. It was my mother, or rather, the woman I'd never known outside my father's shadow. She arrived with downcast eyes and trembling lips. She said she hadn't come to bring doctrine or reconciliation, but that she needed to see with her own eyes if I was okay. I hugged her like embracing a memory. She stayed one night, ate with us, asked little, observed much. The next day, before leaving, she said, "You're more alive than ever." And that, Elsa, is a testimony even your father can't erase. I cried after she left. Not for the absence, but because finally someone from my origins had recognized me without trying to mold me. That was enough. Today, Jonah and I live a quiet life, without spotlights, but full of presence. We still have hard days. We still have doubts, but we never lack courage. Because the love that came from the sea didn't bring just passion. It brought liberation. It didn't save me. It reminded me I always had within me everything I needed to save myself. And if the world ever asks who I am, I'll answer without fear. I'm Elsa, the pastor's daughter, the woman who chose love, and in doing so, chose herself too. Sometimes I still wake before sunrise and walk alone to the shore, not to escape, nor to hide, but to give thanks. The water that once brought a nameless man into my life was the same that washed away my fear, my guilt, my obligation to be what others expected. Jonah remains by my side, with calloused hands and eyes full of peace. We live with little, but what we have is immense. Love, respect, freedom. There's no greater blessing than being who you are and still being loved. Today, when I think of the Elsa from before, the one who lowered her eyes, who asked permission even to dream, I embrace her with tenderness, because she was the one who brought me here. And here, in this place of truth and choice, I finally bloomed.